Welcome, everyone, to the podcast. I'm here with Imran Syed of Hatchproof, and we're here to talk not only about his company, but the future of work and the future of recruiting, which are very hot topics these days. Imran, thank you for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Eric. We've known each other for a while, and this is my
Yeah,
first time doing it, so I feel fortunate.
excellent. Well, we try and keep it loose, and we kind of try and keep it relevant. So I think that's perfect for a rainy Friday in San Francisco. So.
Yeah.
So, as I kind of mentioned, we're talking about future work and recruiting, and there's been a lot of stuff going on. And your current startup right now, as you're a serial entrepreneur, kind of focuses in on that. Do you want to maybe give a brief overview of your startup?
Yeah, and I think it'll be important to kind of give a little preface of where this came from and where this started for me. And I'm fascinated with the future of work in the space. In 2021, I had a chance to take over our HR function at Instapage in my previous company, and my first time managing a people function. And what a trip, right? Like, we had offices around the world, the way data was kind of stored, the way we were thinking about employee experience, employee engagement. And this post-pandemic world, a few things have really fundamentally shifted. And I think the workforce is one of them, and expectations of employers is the other. We saw a lot of our folks asking questions like, why are we working? Where are we working? When are we working? What are we working on? And I remember thinking to myself back in 2021 of like, when I build something next, it's going to be in this space because, it seems really, really intriguing. Um, Half-Proof really came to me when I saw alignment fail at key levels inside our organization. And alignment is really, this notion of how two people work together towards a common function, most commonly attributed to an employee-manager relationship, which
Hmm.
tends to be the biggest predictor of longevity, happiness, growth for an individual. And I saw it collapse. And it collapsed at a level that could have imploded the entire company. And somehow we persevered through it and we got through it. We got to an exit, and that was a lot of fun. But I was left with, what if we could have predicted that? And what would this company's trajectory had been had we predicted that differently? And I was, kind of became a little bit obsessed with the problem and, probably spent 3 months just talking to everybody I knew about, does retention matter? Does alignment matter inside an org? And the resounding answer was yes, it absolutely does. And when people leave a company, it's typically for three reasons. One is, they don't feel valued. And that typically comes from compensation and appreciation. They don't see growth opportunities, both vertical and lateral, like in the sense of I'm doing some cool stuff.
Hmm.
And third, they don't see this alignment with the manager. And I got really sort of fascinated by that component of it. So Hatchproof really helps you predict that. And we figure out alignment early in the hiring process and help you hire differently based on a behavioral model. Then we help you onboard and follow the full employee life cycle, which we call performance. And we do one-on-ones, OKRs, growth, performance, all within one tool and suite.
Interesting. A lot to unpack there. So let me
Yeah.
let me take you back to something earlier you said in your opening, which was, the pandemic caused a lot of people to reevaluate, right? Both employees and employers. And I think post-pandemic, we're seeing that, I'll call it, mm, discussion continue, as much as some people would say it's not the case, right? Um,
Mhm.
but you've seen it from both a leader perspective and you've seen it from an individual contributor perspective. What do you think has caused that schism in terms of, and I want to pick on something because, you know, I think I hear a lot of people nowadays saying it's like, what is the value of my work, right? And why am I doing it? Am I just punching the clock so I can do other
Yeah.
things? Which it sounds like a lot of, especially younger ICs, are saying. But then on the flip side, I mean, you as an entrepreneur and as a startup founder, we have the traditional economic pressures, right? Of I have to make sure I get my ROI back to my venture capitalist in 3 to 5 years, right? And I can't just coddle you. So do you think the schism is growing worse? And if not, or if it is there something we can do to fix it besides recruiting and everything you're doing with your startup?
Yeah, I think three things have fundamentally changed, and we talk about like the workforce and the post-pandemic reality.
Hmm.
We saw some really interesting shifts in that. So in 2022, we saw the Great Resignation,
Hmm.
where you couldn't hire somebody, right? Folks were jumping around from jobs faster than you could even keep them. And I think it was pretty common to see 6-month tenures, and that became sort of expectation. Then in 2024, we saw like the big stay, right? Where
Hmm.
we saw what happens in an economic condition where there isn't a lot of movement, especially in tech, and people decided to stay and hunker down. Gen Zs are, I think that's a really important part of this sliver of workforce. Like the workforce is changing, right?
Hmm.
2024 was substantial because Gen Zs surpassed boomers in terms of workforce representation. And so what's happened is the folks that have typically stayed the longest, 8.4 years, outside of the silent generation, are now being surpassed by the folks that typically stay the least, right? 1.8 years. Millennials are somewhere in the middle of 4.9. And so this challenge of keeping folks inside an organization is only going to continue to increase because the workforce that's coming in to represent that organization is used to shorter stints, right? This is the generation, like I think millennials were the first generation that got really used to leases, right? And not owning things. And we kind of saw this shift in our personal lives, and now we're seeing it in the workforce. I think second most important thing in the macro is we've entered into the AI plus human era, right? And no podcast would be complete without talking about AI at some
Yeah,
point, of course, right?
exactly.
In
Yeah.
2024. But the inflection point of that is as we ask ourselves, what's AI's role in our organization? We're saying the same thing about the people function, right? Do I need 5 people to do this job, or can 3 people do this job? And are those 5 people best suited to do this one particular thing, or should they be shifting in their roles inside an organization? I think job descriptions and titling, it's going to have a huge change in the next 5 years about what we do inside organizations. And so you've seen the rise of like talent intelligence platforms kind of come up in this space, especially in that HR tech world that tell you a lot more of the human capital story and what the value is. And last but not least, what you touched on, fulfillment, right? In developed worlds, especially if I think about our Maslow hierarchy of needs, we're
Hmm.
moving towards self-actualization, right? We're moving towards, something I call self-expansion. And we need this concept of we need to find value in what we're doing because we're spending most of our waking hours doing it. And the workforce that's entering is highly attuned to that, right? It's highly attuned to, hey, I need fulfillment because they've seen fulfillment in other aspects of their life and they expect that to translate into work as well. And so you're starting to see this like, autonomy, flexibility, gig, like, all of this stuff emerge really well because that's the notion of how this workforce is represented and their value system.
You bring up an interesting point, and yes, we will get to generative AI eventually, but I want to poke on something you said, and I think it's a relevant one, where we've moved towards this gig economy. At least I would say some of us have. And the reason I'm poking at that is
Yeah.
my personal opinion. Um, we don't have necessarily the social or governmental structures to allow for that, right? I think there's still an expectation, for instance, if you get a mortgage, that, hey, you have a steady job at a well known company that's going to make it easier than if you are a self employed consultant,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
In order to do that. And then on top of that, especially with the return to office, we've seen a lot of people say, well, why can't I spend 2 weeks in Wyoming, even though I'm supposed to be officially in California? And, there's legal and regulatory. We understand that. So, two questions. Do you think that I'm that, the lack of, let's say, governmental movement towards acknowledging these changes in terms of towards the gig economy is going to be a big factor? And then you as a startup founder, does that make your job more difficult if the tenures are shorter, if you have to constantly be recruiting and you don't necessarily get that consistency in terms of employees as you're trying to build in a rapid fashion.
Yeah, great questions. And so, um, the example you give around like getting a mortgage or like the way you're viewed in certain structures, um, what are we actually assessing? We're assessing somebody's stability to be able to repay
Hmm.
a loan or some sort of level of credit that they've taken on. I think the construct of how we arrive at that decision has to change, right? It
Hmm.
has to change. And I agree with you. I don't think as a society and as a culture in large, it has, right? And so you still have these relics of this is how I evaluated your ability to be stable and this definition of stability. Um, and truthfully, like if you make $100,000 and you do it from four sources, you do it from one source, what's important at the end of the day is that you're making that $100,000 if that's going towards, some sort of obligation that you need to put it towards. So I think from a societal standpoint, we're going to start to see a shift take place in this. Are we there yet? No, we're not, right? There's a lot of legal legislation as well as like just marketplaces and frameworks that are just so well established, Eric. Like you know this better than I do, coming from
Yeah.
Visa in the past, it's like hard to
Hmm.
break that, hard to
Yeah.
break that pattern. I think like I'm not romanticized with the concept that somebody is going to work at a career for 30 years.
Hmm.
But I'm still not bought in that we want to be switching jobs every year or every couple of years. I think we want to be taking challenging opportunities that help us grow, that help us expand, that help us learn. And if that environment can exist inside the construct of an organization that you're familiar with, we'll take it. Um,
Hmm.
and I think that's what we're trying to solve for within Hatchproof of helping you first and foremost find the people you want to work with on both sides. As a candidate, figuring out organizations, as an organization, figuring out those candidates. And secondly, helping you create an environment that's constantly learning, informed through that alignment to help you grow and have your best day at work and have a sustained work environment. Still, I think there's probably going to be a cliff of I need to go outside or external or different industry altogether to keep my growth at a certain level. But I don't think that's a year. I don't think that's 2 years. I think that's more like a 3 to 5 year horizon of helping us fall in love.
Interesting. All right, we'll start turning towards generative AI. I think in your second and third points, right? You mentioned fulfillment, and you also mentioned generative AI. So the sense I get from a lot of individual contributors is that with generative AI, they're kind of, I would say rebelling, but I would say questioning the value of like, hey, I have to put 10,000 hours to become a subject matter expert. Or why am I doing with this repetitive job when potentially I could get laid off or my work reassigned to a generative AI in 2 years? So, you know, thinking about that, how do you as an entrepreneur, as a founder, kind of make sure that your employees don't necessarily have that I'll call it generative AI fear, right? In terms of, hey, the work I'm doing is not valuable. It doesn't really fulfill me. So how do you kind of address that?
Well, it's a great question. And first and foremost, like, is the fear really a generative AI fear? Or
Mm,
is the fear, how will I pay my mortgage if I don't have a job?
hmm.
And how will I support my lifestyle and the other things that are in there? Um, I would argue that the fear is more around that. I have a certain set of skills. I have a certain set of experiences that make me uh, an expert or good at something. And now I need to evolve beyond that. And
Hmm.
that's not easy. Change is definitely not easy. Um, and we've seen this with technology in the past, and where we had telephone operators, right? We had switchboards
Hmm.
that would connect phone lines. And in fact, I think at one point it was the largest employer um, of stay-at-home moms and women in the workforce was just switchboard operators.
Hmm.
That job doesn't exist anymore, right? As technology evolved beyond that. And so I think there's a lot of jobs that exist today that are going to evolve beyond it. And just like we have in the past, we too will evolve into new roles and new skills. I also want to say that I think the construct of our 5-day work week will go away. And I am for us kind of moving towards different work structures, because what we have now is, again, like, I think, a relic of the industrial age and the way we saw
Hmm.
factory output, and doing something in multiple shifts and 5 days a week and etc. And I think there's a lot of complexities of this, right? To shift this into real, whether it's white collar or blue collar, into real application, because stocks get traded on a Friday. You've got production lines on a Friday. Like, it can't be like a widespread, but this notion of we have to put in 40 hours a week or more into a work environment, I think that too is going to go away. And this balance of fulfillment for us will come from a balance in both personal fulfillment and, something that we want to pursue for monetary and, intellectual stimulations that we call work.
Interesting. Um, that's definitely something to dive a bit deeper in, but I think another podcast for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
You know, getting to, one of the great things about Hatchproof was recruiting, right? And you mentioned culture and onboarding. And again, we've seen the recruiting landscape change, right? With
Yeah.
generative AI, with technology in general, right? With the talent acquisition systems and how, you can easily apply to any job on LinkedIn for like 30 seconds. And you kind of hit something on the head. I think in terms of people looking for fulfillment, they're just not looking necessarily just for a job. They're looking for something that fulfills them, right? From a intellectual, from a work, and potentially a personal perspective. So how do you see I'll call it talent acquisition aspect of hiring changing in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah. I do, want to appreciate that there's a lot of us that need to work because of monetary
Hmm.
outcomes, right? And we need that exchange of goods and services that has to take place. And sometimes our job searches aren't inspirational, right? And we're just applying to everything
Hmm.
because we're in a position that we have obligations and we need to fulfill on it. But let's just say in a ideal world, right, where we have choice and we are looking for an opportunity, we tend to go beyond the resume, right? We tend to look at an organization, we tend to look at the leaders in that organization, the representation of it, the product, the service, and like our connection to it. And so we want fulfillment. We want belonging. I talk to a lot of individuals right now, and um, some of them are so burnt out of
Hmm.
applying for jobs. And Eric, you probably hear it as well, right? Like,
Hmm.
I applied to 100 things, I didn't get any callbacks. And um, the truth is, they probably shouldn't have applied to 90 or 95 of those, right?
Hmm.
But it's hard to find that connection point, and organizations don't really do a good job of telling you about a company beyond a job description, right? If I
Hmm.
if I think about the nature of that relationship, candidate, employer, employer tends to hold all the cards
Hmm.
of that relationship. I think that needs to change. I think candidates need to better understand who it is they're going to work for. And again, one of the things that Hatchproof allows them to do. And then make a decision of, like, do I want to go work for this person? Or the attributes of this person as a whole and the organization that they represent. So I think that's a fundamental shift. I believe in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see a lot more AI in hiring.
Mm,
Um, and I think AI is going to help us um, decipher like large data sets, what it does really well in terms of finding patterns for success, and that trend's going to continue. What we're seeing right now from a top level organizational standpoint is that candidates are using AI to update their resumes, update their cover letters, and
hmm
applying for jobs. And at the top of the funnel there, it's really difficult to decipher who's a good fit
hmm
because everybody is now getting a stronger playing field because they're using tools that are out there as they should. And so I think, again, hiring on skill sets alone, where you can't really decipher who's good, who's okay, who's excellent, um, behavioral models become important and what we're trying to do because you can't really change that. You can't really fake that through an AI.
Interesting. You kind of hit the nail on the head. It seems like we're almost moving in towards a postmodern version of talent acquisition, right? It's less about skills and more about the fit or the culture. Um, do you think that potential could run into some, I'll call it broader cultural and societal issues, right? I mean, we saw that, we're seeing that globally. Actually, let me be honest, right? In terms of like the political spectrum, the increasing divide. Do you think that this emphasis on behavioral traits and culture might be risky when it comes from a talent acquisition perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. I do believe that um, one of our main drivers from a behavioral model is our goal isn't to help you hire more people that think like you, look like you,
Hmm
act like you. It's to create sort of and provide candidates of diverse thought, right,
hmm
with the team. And if I think about like the broader macro, one of the glaring themes to me is that we need to do a better job of listening to each other and
hmm
understanding the things that sort of divide us as a whole. I think humans actually add more bias than I think behavioral models too, right? When we hire from a skills-based standpoint, we see a lot of things go wrong. I think 38% of new hires don't make it past the first year. We run into a lot of challenges around bias, people that went to schools that we went to that look like us, talk like us, etc., in the hiring foray. And so the goal is to really help improve that by actually looking at key characteristics that are set across our model. And so our model is the name of the company, right? So we look at habits, aspirations, temperament, convictions, and hard skills. Skills are still important, but skills don't really give you the full picture. And so we're trying to
hmm
actually create the full picture for candidates and employers.
Interesting. And we could definitely dive a bit more in terms of talent acquisition, but you hit another big nail on the head when you mentioned onboarding, right?
Yeah.
That seems to be a make or break for a lot of companies. And a lot of companies, if from what I've seen personally and also through a lot of studies, is that we don't do it well. And why do you think that is? I mean, let's just kind of like go straight towards the question.
I think we've got an enormous amount of pressure to show results inside an organization.
Hmm
And we kind of transfer that pressure onto a candidate or a new hire pretty quickly. Um, I also think we're just not really honest as employers with candidates on expectations. I think it's we kind of blur the lines of like nice to haves and actual realities. Um, I know that both as an employee and as an employer, like I've had tremendous pressure on me on both sides of it to show results fast. Um, and Eric, like I think that's the number one driver of like why we move so quickly through that process, even though we know that those first 90 days matter, right? Like we're in
hmm
the United States, we're seeing the presidential shift taking place in January. And what are we going to talk about January 1st? We're going to talk about the first 100 days. And
Hmm.
the first 100 days for a president are critical and sets the tone for the entire administration. The first 90 days for any employee are critical for their long-term tenure. Um, Yet, a lot of employers move really quickly because of the drive to show results. I think, secondly, we treat everybody the same. And
Mm.
we have this like one size fits all to onboarding approach. And
Hmm.
you kind of come in and it's, whether it's through a software or just a document, it's like, here's the people you're talking to, here's the things you're doing, here's the software you're using, here's some of the goals you have. And we kind of treat everybody the same way. And we're all really unique, we're all really different. And one of the differentiators for Hatchproof again is like if you're preventative style or promotion style, we'll actually adopt the onboarding process to fit your needs. So if you're promotion, let's get you in front of as many people in the organization as possible because that adds to your belonging. If you're preventative style, let's get you using the tools to make you feel comfortable at the job because that's important for you to feel. And so I think like we got to get out of this like one size fits all. And unfortunately, onboarding kind of gets confused with compliance, right? There's things like you
Mm.
got to get your laptop, do your I-9 verification, and that is a part of onboarding, but it's compliance.
Hmm.
It's not what's actually connecting you to that organization and their mission, vision, and values.
Interesting. I mean, talk a bit more about the preventative style and the promotional style. Is that a proprietary model, or are you using some academic literature for that one? It sounds
Oh
interesting, and I
yeah,
think totally relevant.
yeah. Our chief scientist is a brilliant PhD in behavioral science, and
Hmm.
we've taken 100 years of science to kind of drive these models and look at and build on, the shoulders of giants before us. And the truth is, like, science has helped decode what actually works at work.
Hmm.
And just like compatibility in personal relationships, we know what compatibility looks like in a work environment, and what helps you sort of thrive in it. And so when we look at habits, habits really represent the core of who you are. It's like your character traits, it's your dispositions, your unique blend. When we think about aspirations, we look at the guiding light of what you truly care about in your professional life and in your work life. Temperament is like how you regulate emotions at work, how you cope with stress at work. Convictions are like what drive you at work, right? What are those major motivations? And hard skills, we all know what hard skills kind of represent. And
Hmm.
that gives us this like holistic science-based model approach to meaningful behavior inside of organizations and really understanding the fundamentals there.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Let me ask you an interesting question. Do you think, especially now with the flattening of organizations that's been happening over the past probably 2 to 3 decades, as
Yeah.
well as the shift towards fulfillment, that one of the unacknowledged things is not only is I think it's definitely acknowledged that the employer-employee relationship has changed, but employees themselves have to be more entrepreneurial. I don't want to necessarily say as an entrepreneurial founder like yourself, but in some respects, we increasingly have to, as employees, be entrepreneurs or like figure out our own destiny. Would you say that's a fair statement?
I think we have I think we have more of a say in our destiny. And I feel
Mm.
like there's probably some folks out there that are going to disagree with me and say that, hey, I have zero control over where I'm going inside this organization. But I do think that there's more, um, the employee is more a part of that conversation. And if they're not, they should be in their environments of determining longevity and where they're headed in that organization. Um, and then the other thing I'll add, Eric, is like the amount of time that we have to figure it out. is shorter because we're
Hmm.
not staying at companies for decades anymore. A large part. It still happens here and there, but like largely we're not. So this idea of like an annual performance review seems so archaic to me. Um, our approach to performance is you should be having performance when things are going right and when things aren't going right. And we have a way of figuring out those inflection points to enable those conversations to happen, both from your personal and your organizational drive, which is, again, based on science and really cool. Annual performance reviews worked when we worked 10, 30 years at a company. And that's
Hmm.
what we look forward to. And that's when the conversation of growth would take place. And typically, now I think performance is an everyday conversation. It's a weekly conversation at minimum, that you're
Hmm.
having because we also know the second biggest driver to keep somebody at a company is where am I headed? What's my growth opportunities? And that needs to be a constant conversation. And so, yeah, I think those two factors are real drivers in it.
Interesting. Well, I think we're almost coming up at time, Imran. I always like to leave the last word or sage words of wisdom to our guests. So, Imran, what are some final words that you want to impart to our audience?
I think the future of work is an exciting place, and um, I love where it's evolving to. You use the word interesting quite a bit. I think it is really interesting, and I think we have an opportunity to help define it. Just like 100 years ago, our forefathers, defined this construct of work that we're in today. AI shouldn't be something that we're afraid of. I think AI is something that we should embrace. Um, Being uncomfortable is scary, but it's never yielded us more opportunity than I think it does now, both in our tooling and what we're going to evolve to be. We just need to figure out a way to pay our mortgage off to make it easier.
Sounds good. And
Yeah,
I love those final words of wisdom. So, Imran, thank you again for appearing on the podcast.
my pleasure. Thanks for having me.